Faith of Our Fathers, Chapter 2. There's No Place Like Home. Just across town up Peachtree Street from Jake's house, at the same time he was emerging from the shower, I raised my whiskey, the first of my evening, in a toast, waving the glass around in the air towards my best friend and drinking buddy, Kit Holloway, sitting across the small candlelit table from me. I pronounced with staunch enthusiasm, "Here's to us doing this." Kit also raised her glass, also a double whiskey, from where we'd been comfortably ensconced inside the back corner booth at McNeely's Pub. It was Saturday evening, October 8th, 1988. I'd just noticed Put This Love to the Test by John Astley playing on the jukebox as we ordered our first round of drinks, never realizing at the time how prophetic that song might have seemed. McNeely's was a local watering hole drinking establishment and familiar haunt of ours on Peachtree Street, close to Kit's apartment at Twingate on 26th Street, just down the road. It was also very close to our ultimate destination that night, Piedmont Park. The thing I toasted to us doing was the event of our 10-year high school reunion being held that night at the Piedmont Driving Club. The Driving Club, a hobnob members-only organization adjacent to the aforementioned park known by its same name. To us doing this, Kit saluted me back before second-guessing her resolve along with our motives halfway through her sip of whiskey. "So are we really doing this?" "You tell me." I held up both my hands in a defensive posture, first depositing my whiskey glass back on the tabletop. "This was all your bright idea. It's all on you, my dear." I must have been drunk. "Of course you were drunk. We were both drunk," I shot back, the obvious at her in a jovial sneer. "But you've had well over a month now to sober up and regain the good sense to change your mind." "Only because I keep thinking there's a slim possibility we might actually have fun." "I'm always willing to drink to possibilities." I picked up my glass and took another big gulp of my whiskey, wincing in a broad grin as the brown liquid trickled slowly and evocatively down the back of my throat. "Ooh, that burns so good." "I know," Kit agreed, winking at me. "Are we going to have another before we face I don't know exactly what to call it. What is it that we're about to face over there? Onslaught? Deluge? Battalions? Enemy? Firing squad? Firing squad! There you go." Kit raised her glass high into the air, demonstrating her approval of my terminology. "And abso-fucking-lutely we're going to have another before we go. Maybe a couple more. Firing squads require massive amounts of liquid courage." "I'll drink to that," Kit concurred. Upon our initial arrival at the pub, Kit had ordered herself a White Russian. But I quickly dissuaded her from the idea, persuading her instead that an overabundance of heavy cream mixed with vodka and Kahlua perhaps might not be the most prudent choice, either for her tummy or for her head in the morning, over the course of what would undoubtedly turn out to be a long evening for the both of us. So we subsequently agreed on tequila shots with beer chasers. However, when neither of us could remember whether the old adage correctly states that beer on whiskey is mighty risky, or that whiskey on beer puts you in the clear, or some variation on one of those themes, not to mention making our already antsy cocktail waitress increasingly impatient with our indecision, we ultimately concluded that double shots of some good Irish whiskey would do the trick. We ordered a couple of Jameson 1780s neat, both doubles. My lost bet with Kit 1 month prior, when she'd first mentioned the idea of going to our high school reunion together, was what got me hoodwinked into this evening in the first place. As agreed, I'd pick Kit up shortly after 6 p.m. that Saturday evening. The reunion started at 7 o'clock, so we had plenty of time to fortify ourselves decidedly with a few stiff drinks beforehand. Sitting there at McNeely's, sipping whiskey with Kit, I had no idea that something extraordinary was about to happen in my life that night at our reunion. "Oh, and by the way, silly me," I used self-deprecation as another reason to toast and drink. "Here's to your new promotion at the bank, Madam Vice President." "Well, thank you very much, although it's not so big a deal. The bank promotes everybody to vice president in order to avoid giving us anything that resembles real money." "Well, you should make a very big deal about it with all those snotty loveteers tonight," I advised. all of them vying for one another's attentions with competing tales of their wealth and success. Oh God, I already dread it. Why did I think this was a good idea? Search me, kitten. But here's what you do when we get there. The director in me pretended to be Kit, turning from one empty chair at our table to the next, pulling on grand airs of pretense. Hi, Kit Holloway. So good to see you again. I went to Vanderbilt University, as you may recall, and now I'm vice president of First Atlanta Bank. Then, hello, I completed my undergraduate studies at Vanderbilt in Nashville, Tennessee, and now I'm vice president of a major banking institution. Eventually, you'll probably just have it shortened down to Kit, Vanderbilt, vice president. Next in line, please. You're ridiculous, Wes Calvert. I know, I am, but that's why you love me. And I love you too, kitten. This is true, but hey, your resume is far more impressive than mine. Northwestern, Emory for a while, University of Georgia Law School, then big Savannah law firm. Yeah, but my punchline to my CV ends with unemployed. Ding, 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 ding. See ya, loser. You'll find a job in no time, Kit reassured me. And I intend to do some networking there and amongst our more affluent classmates tonight. That is not a bad idea. At least people will remember you. All depends on how they remember me, I added. Nobody there's going to remember me, Kit Holloway. Who's that? Oh, that timid little shrinking Violet who always tried her best to blend into the wallpaper walking down the halls of the upper school. Untrue. Anyway, I continued, you've got us both going back into the Lovett fray just to face the firing squad voluntarily. Are we also going to put on our own blindfolds and light our own cigarettes before they commence shooting at us? God, I would kill for a cigarette right now. Kit tossed her head back and looked blankly up at the ceiling. I can't believe I quit smoking just before going to this crazy reunion thing. Proud of you, though, and I'm proud of you for coming at all, under all your protest, which I have duly noted and someday will manage to make up to you somehow, in some fashion. It's good for you to get out and about a bit. You doing better, about things? I'm great. Why do you ask that? Do I need to be better? I pretended ignorance. And better than what, anyways? Oh, I don't know, Kit mused, playing along with me. Better than from your months of abandoned, pathetic, wounded puppy dog-looking eyes over some little prick of a muddle boy from New York City moving here to town to do his best to break your heart? Oh, him! I tossed her off nonchalantly. Jim Harper? Meh. Yeah, meh. Him. That boy is so far away removed ancient history to me now, Kit. I promise you, no more pathetic puppy dog eyes or heartbroken facial expression. Causes premature wrinkles way before my time. Even I got so bored with myself wearing that overly pathetic face. Besides giving me wrinkles, I found myself craving dog biscuits. I can only imagine how bored you got looking at me, listening to me drone on and on about my many loves lost traversities. Nah, I didn't really mind it all that much. Kit waved her hand in the air, sort of like reading a drugstore romance novel. Besides, that's what friends are for. I'm just glad you're feeling better now. Jim Harper and I had met the previous January in a gay bar down in Savannah, Georgia, where I was living and practicing law at the time, and where Jim was visiting as a tourist. Jim was living and working in Atlanta when we'd met. I moved to Atlanta in August, presumably to be with Jim, but things hadn't worked out at all as I had hoped or expected. Now, nearly 2 months later, I was going on a date with my best girlfriend, or best friend, who just also happened to be a girl, to our high school reunion. Nothing about my life had turned out anything similar to how I'd once planned it to be. Jim Harper, I repeated his name as it likely had been indelibly etched into the crevices of my consciousness for all of eternity. I barely even remember him anymore. Why do you always refer to this fellow Jim by his full name like that? Kit inquired of me through her furrowed brow over the lip of her glass. I don't know, I shrugged truthfully. I guess it's sort of like we always refer to armed assassins by all three of their given names. John Wilkes Booth, Lee Harvey Oswald, James Earl Ray. Does that mean Jim Harper was the assassin of your heart? Attempted assassin only. My ticker's still on life support, though at times only barely hanging on, I reported with a mockingly downtrodden frown. That's why I only refer to him by his two proper names, Jim Harper. Otherwise, he would be James Mabry Harper, and I would be dead. To surviving attempted assassin's bullets with only 2 names, Kit toasted me, and to friendship. I polished off the last of my whiskey, as did Kit with her toast, especially the lasting kind. To us, she chortled back. And as for the model boy from New York, guess mine is not the first heart broken. I recited lyrics to Kit from the classic Grease torch song, Hopelessly Devoted to You. And your eyes were not the first to cry either, Miss Olivia Newton-John, Kit quipped back at me, picking up immediately on my song reference. Hey, I'll drink to that. I pounded the table with my fist and raised my empty glass over my head to summon our waitress and order a next round. Barkeep, more whiskeys. Have you had your rebound guy yet? Kit asked cautiously. Because if you have, you haven't said anything about it to me. About him, I mean. Me? I inquired back. Require a rebound guy from a drop-dead gorgeous New York City Wilhelmina modeling agency fella who I dated for 6 months and moved back home to Atlanta for 2 months ago just to hold, worship, and adore, forsaking all others? Nope, not me. No rebound shots required, but right now I do want more whiskey. Have you dated anybody at all since you've been back in town? Kit wasn't going to let me change the subject through humor. I worry about you. Please don't worry. There's nothing to worry about, I reasoned. And no, I just haven't had the energy to date or go out on the hunt or even to fool around or anything. I'm just not sure true love's worth all the misery and agony it's chalked up to be. For what it's worth, I'm with you there. She raised her empty glass and wondered, what do you have to do around this place to get another drink? And just keep in mind, Missy, our own marriage contract comes due in another 6.5 years, I reminded her. If neither of us is married by the ripe old age of 35, Kit recited our agreed upon terms back to me, then we shall pledge our troth to love, honor, and fuck around on each other till death do us part. I'll drink to that. I owed my own still empty glass and eyed Kit. Do you think it's true if we toast with empty glasses, it keeps it from coming true? We can only hope, so we put our empty cocktail glasses together with gusto. Then just as soon as the cocktail waitress set our second round down on the table, Kit raised her finally full glass of whiskey. And until then, here's mud in your eye. Better mud than tears, I raised my equally replenished glass to clank again with hers. That early evening at McNeely's Pub in 1988, where Kit and I began tying on a satisfactorily competent buzz before heading over to our class reunion, you could say turned into the night the age of our innocence ended once and for all. That year proved both strange and wonderful for many of a wide variety of reasons. 1988, George Herbert Walker Bush got elected the 41st president of these United States in November. And just a month prior to that, our 10-year high school reunion was scheduled over a long weekend in our early October. Annual reunions were always held at our dear old alma mater to coincide with the weekend of the high school's varsity's football team homecoming game. As customary with every reunion weekend before or since at ye old, estimately snobbish Lovett School in Atlanta, Georgia, on Thursday night of reunion weekend, a meet and greet cocktail party took place for all the returning graduates, generally held at some ritzy mansion belonging to one of our more wealthy, or at least pretentious and supposedly wealthy, class graduates. For our graduating class of 1978 reunion, the Thursday night cocktail party occurred at the home of our classmate, Beverly Hollingsworth Houston, in the Northwest Atlanta mansion located strategically just off West Paces Ferry Road, which she shared with her recently minted husband Reese and some undisclosed number of toddler children being cared for by their nanny that night. Friday night, as was also school tradition, our reunion committee scheduled a ubiquitous barbecue cookout tailgate party in the parking lot of the high school, followed by the mandatory and excruciatingly boring homecoming football game. Generally, the homecoming game stood out as the only game of the season our Lovett Lions managed to win, primarily because it was always intentionally scheduled against the weakest team in the division. This remained true to form both throughout our 4 high school years and then again in the 1988 football season of our reunion. Saturday night, however, was the pièce de la résistance, for Saturday night was the big class reunion dance party at one of the exclusive country clubs around town. Individual standalone tickets for the dance party cost $50 each, or $80 for a couple. Package deal reunion tickets for all three events went for $75 per individual, or $125 for those of us lucky enough or willing enough to bring a date along. The Saturday night dance party for our 10-year reunion was held at the Piedmont Driving Club adjacent to Piedmont Park. Snazzy and elegant, while not quite as prestigious as the Cherokee Town and Country Club located up on the north side of town, close to the stately Leavitt campus, by some outrageously unforgivable, indeed horrifying, scheduling oversight, the Cherokee Club had already been booked for the Saturday night of our reunion weekend in 1988. All of us perfectly indignant 1978 Leavitt School graduates were promised by our reunion planning committee that heads would roll at the administrative offices over at the Cherokee Club. At least we could all rest easier night with strictly top-tiered reassurances of swift and appropriately cruel retribution for such egregious transgressions against a huge slice of Atlanta's most elite citizenry. That August of 1988, just a few months before our reunion, I'd moved back home to Atlanta after having lived away for all of the past 10 years. I completed my undergraduate degree at Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois, just north of Chicago. Those brutal Chicago winters with the Arctic winds off Lake Michigan were unbearably cold for my thin Southern boy blood. So after 4 years, I returned to the South, closer to home, to attend law school at the University of Georgia over in Athens. After law school, I ended up practicing law for a little more than 3 years down in Savannah. I chose Savannah mainly because it was so close to the beach, but also because at the time I had no desire or intention to return home to Atlanta. Not ever. Quite intentionally and quite literally during the preceding 10 years, I had kept in touch with only and exactly 5 people from our graduating high school class. So I ultimately, and I believe wisely, decided to opt out of cocktails at Beverly Hollingsworth Houston's house, pronounced Houston, not Houston, like the city in Texas. Beverly was not one of those 5 rare friends I had maintained in my circle for the past decade since high school. I also respectively declined my invitation to the Friday night tailgater and uninspired football game. One of my favorite remaining high school friends, obviously, was Kit. Shortly after my return home to Atlanta, over a night which included a few too many cocktails, Kit had convinced me, albeit reluctantly, to attend the Saturday night reunion dance party with her. My agreement came only as a result of me losing a bet to her over a badly executed drinking game. Undoubtedly, she likely cheated. Kit was born in late May 1960. I had been born just the previous March. At the time of our births, our parents lived next door to each other in 2 small 2-bedroom brick townhouses in an area to the north of Atlanta known as Buckhead. In 1960, the Buckhead, which has today become a far more exclusive, highfalutin social, corporate, and residential hub of the city, back then represented an advancement in suburbia as a strictly working-class walking neighborhood. In its capacity as a haven for the up-and-coming futures of Atlanta's business world, our young executive fathers would kiss our housewife mothers goodbye each morning of their work week before methodically making their way down Peachtree Street into the sprawling urban metropolis to the south. Mrs. Holloway and my mother were friends, exchanging news and the day's gossip, drinking the last of the morning coffee and smoking cigarettes while sitting together out on our shared back porch. So Kit and I were next-door neighbors and presumably baby crib mates for the first year or so of our lives. Everyone calls my friend Kit because her baby sister, Marguerite, could not properly pronounce her name, Catherine, thus shortening it to Kit. So when they were both toddlers at some point, I would guess, after her family had moved away from our adjacent townhomes on Buckhead Avenue, Kit became Kit. Eventually, she was unintentionally vindicated, however, when she had similar difficulty, for whatever reason, saying Marguerite, and instead of calling her baby sister Midge. Thereafter, Midge's nickname stuck as well. So it came to pass that Polly and William Holloway swooped up 2-year-old Kit and her infant sister Midge and took them to their new home in Collier Hills before either Kit or I could verbalize each other's names. Whether or not we would have pronounced our names correctly remains a mystery for the ages. Kit and I probably never would have met again were it not for the Supreme Court of the United States using its legal clout to enforce racial integration and busing standards throughout the South. In early 1970s, federally mandated school desegregation utilized busing in an attempt to reduce racial disparity within school districts. Not terribly surprisingly, busing met considerable angry opposition from white people. The movement of large numbers of white families to the suburbs in larger cities created a phenomenon known as white flight, attempting to maintain the status quo among homogeneous, white-only neighborhoods. Many white families who stayed inside urban areas moved their children into private or parochial schools in order to circumvent integration. As for me personally, growing up in Atlanta during the 1960s and 70s seemed far distant and removed from those areas of unrest which I now know as ushering in tumultuous times of political protest and bloody clashes between opposing forces on different sides seeking either to claim or to deny civil rights. Instead, I led a young life of sheltered, sequestered, and yes, segregated, childlike, unconcerned bliss in our whitewashed neighborhoods on the northern outskirts of the capital city of the South. I knew something in general about how Rosa Parks made news by riding some bus, but that never really made a lot of sense to my child's mind. The name Martin Luther King Jr. was spoken there and about, but never loudly, nor for long, nor substantive discussions. All of the adults I ever heard talk about Dr. King were in complete agreement with each other that he was a troublemaker, but at least he was a troublemaker making trouble peacefully without any more unwanted violence on either side. Matters of racial unrest were all tacitly taboo subjects or discussed in hushed undertones within the refined, polite, civilized society in northern circles of greater Atlanta. Of course, we were never taught about such matters as civil rights in the public school system, and certainly not in private educational institutions either. And so most of us, including myself, simply remained ignorant. When I was 4 years old, my parents had followed suit with our neighbors, the Holloways, from the rental townhouses on Buckhead Avenue, and they bought our first house. Rather than Collier Hills closer in towards town, my folks opted to move further out, barely within the city limits. Our new neighborhood was located in an area known as Pine Hills, out amongst cow pastures and horse farms, near a small, nondescript shopping plaza called Lenox Square. Living in a Pine Hills home on Rockhaven Circle, a tiny roundabout street nestled cozily in between a dairy farm and the train tracks of Southern Railway, my parents ensured me a seat in the most revered, well-respected, and institutionally sound public school in northeastern Atlanta, R.L. Hope Elementary. At R.L. Hope, located on Piedmont Road just north of its intersection with Peachtree Street, only a stone's throw down from Lenox Square, I began my education in kindergarten. It was expected that I would progress all the way up through 8th grade at R.L. Hope before moving over to North Fulton High School. My parents always referred to me attending high school at North Fulton as a bridge which we would cross when we got there. Only when I got old enough to begin to understand my parents' undercurrent racism, along with my own inbred white privilege, did I realize that the always far-off bridge of North Fulton High School was a bridge which Carolyn and CQ never intended for me to cross. As a public high school, North Fulton was attended by a vast majority of teenage students from grades 9 through 12 inside the city of Atlanta. A significant number of those teenage students were black kids. During my 3rd grade year at R.L. Hope, I got placed in the classroom of Mrs. Betty Condry, my teacher. I use the word placed here because my mother made the arrangement for my placement in Mrs. Condry's class directly with her friend and the school principal, Miss Marilyn Adair. My mother used the same arrangement with Miss Adair to get me placed into Mrs. Ballinger's 4th grade class and subsequently into Miss McLaughlin's class for the 5th grade. Miss Adair was a kindly yet regimented older spinster schoolteacher who still lived with her sister, Miss Elizabeth Westbrook. It never dawned on me until a decade or so later to ask my mother how Miss Adair and Miss Elizabeth were sisters both of whom never married, and yet they didn't have the same last name. That, precious darling, my mother informed me with a sly, wicked grin, is precisely the question I asked Miss Adair when I marched into her principal's office and convinced her to assign to you to Mrs. Condry's and then to Mrs. Bellinger's and ultimately to Miss McLaughlin's classrooms. I don't get it, I pondered her answer to me, perplexed. Well, my mother explained more fully, Miss Adair preferred to let me choose the elementary school teachers for you than for her to have to answer my questions about Miss Elizabeth. So I still wasn't quite sure I understood my mother's implied context. Then suddenly her meaning became absolutely crystal clear to me as I exclaimed, looking wide-eyed back at her, "Oh!" And I mouthed the word lesbians in wonderment at my own naivete. Mama simply raised her eyebrows back at me, confirming my presumption. Mrs. Condry had astoundingly colored Lucille Ball flaming red hair, which she always sharply parted and combed all the way over to the side of her head, teasing it mercilessly and puffing it out until it resembled an elongated chrysanthemum in the shape of a gigantic cucumber laying over her right ear. I always observed hers to be the most unusual hairdo, but it fit Mrs. Condry, matching her jolly laugh and wonderfully natured disposition. Mrs. Condry always marveled at my artistic abilities, especially given my concentrated attention to detail in my artwork. My parents informed me that I was very fortunate to have Mrs. Condry as my teacher for the third grade. Everyone at Arl Hope Elementary, including Miss Adair, had suspected that Mrs. Condry would never return to teaching after her son and only child, Michael, had been killed over in Vietnam the preceding year. It would be many years before my child's brain could make any sense of the strange word Vietnam, where it was, why Mrs. Condry's son had gone there, and what he had died for there. One Monday morning over breakfast during the third grade, I asked my parents if I could invite Dahlia Ryan from my class over after school one afternoon that week. They agreed after a small amount of amused questioning, specifically if I was worried that some of the other little girls in my class might get jealous. I answered no, because the thought of jealousy had never entered my mind in terms of playing after school with anyone. I explained to my parents that Dahlia and I were the most supreme champions of playing foursquare ball at recess, and together we could triumphantly beat anybody in the school at our game. When I was in the third grade in 1968, about 8 years old, it was a common practice for children to invite their friends and classmates over to play after school. I guess this is what you now would refer to in modern day equivalent terminology as a play date. Back then, in any case, it was pretty much summarized by a kid asking, "Hey mom, can so-and-so come home with me after school?" I was a social little boy, sort of a precocious character and fairly popular, so it was fairly typical for that I would either invite someone over to my house to play after school, or I would be invited over to one of my friends' houses, Colleen Masterson, Bill Floyd, Rusty Cantrell, Susan Townsend, and especially Connor Burrows. Oh boy, Connor Burrows. Whew. They were some of my favorite friends who I most enjoyed spending time with weekdays after school. Oh, and also Linda Graham from across the street. Of course, there was also Linda. So that same day, at some point during the fall in Ms. Condry's third grade class, I invited Dahlia Ryan over to my house after school. She gladly accepted, so we agreed on the next afternoon, Tuesday, all of which I informed my mom of when I got home. It was all set. Dahlia would ride the bus home from school with me, and then, as per usual, at the end of our after-school play event, my mother and I would drive Dahlia home. This was 1968. So there was no need for mothers to call up one another to confirm the plans their children made together. And since only kids in our general vicinity attended my grammar school, my mother never considered whether or not she would have to drive very far to take my playmate home once we finished playing that particular afternoon. The next day, on Tuesday afternoon after school, Dahlia and I stepped down from the school bus and walked the short distance up our cement driveway to our low-lying red brick ranch-style home, the ultimate prize and pride of all suburbia. My mom, no doubt, had been watching us from the kitchen window, and she greeted us warmly at the kitchen door with a plate full of exquisite smelling warm chocolate chip cookies with pecans in them, my favorites, and 2 glasses of ice cold milk waiting for us at the breakfast room table. It was truly a heavenly after school event. Following snacks, Dahlia and I went into the den to turn on the television and play with a wide variety of my number of choices from an extensive collection of toys. My mother stayed in the kitchen, and quite atypically, she pushed the kitchen door to the den closed. I can only remember that kitchen door being closed twice during the more than 30 years we lived there in that house. Once that afternoon when Dahlia came over to play, and once again when my parents were having a serious discussion before my mother took me to a hotel and left my father for 3 consecutive days. Before the kitchen door closed for their serious discussion and subsequent separation, I had witnessed my father strike my mother for the very first time, and presumably also for the very last time. Before very much time had passed that afternoon with Dahlia and me in the den playing, my mom opened back up the kitchen door and everything immediately seemed to return to normal. However, about 30 minutes later, my dad came home early from work, very early, something that rarely, if ever, happened. I heard him speaking with my mom briefly in the kitchen. Then, still wearing his coat and his top hat on his head, he came into the den, told me hello, and introduced himself to Dahlia as my father, Mr. Calvert. Then he told us that we had to take Dahlia home early that afternoon. "Ah, Dad," I protested, "but we're not done playing yet." My dad sternly said it would have to do for now, and that we had to get Dahlia back home, and we had to do it right then. On our way out the door, Dahlia thanked my mother very politely for the cookies and milk and for letting her come over to play. Once we were outside, Dad instructed me to ride along, and when we got in the car, he told me to sit up in the front seat with him. And he said to Dahlia, "And as for you, little lady, why don't you hop right back here in the back seat, and we'll chauffeur you right on home." I didn't think to ask my father at the time why Dahlia had to sit in the back seat while he and I rode up front. I guess because I didn't know then that it was a rule. Over the next few years, I observed certain phenomena, all the while knowing not to ask questions about it. Maids always rode in the back seat of the car when white men drove them home from working at their houses, in order to avoid any appearance of impropriety, or that they might be a couple like that scandalous Richard and Mildred Loving up in Virginia. My cousins in Pine Mountain chauffeured their maid Celia home in that manner, just as did Uncle Olin down in Jackson, with their housekeeper Ada riding in the back seat when he drove her home. Turned out, Dahlia didn't live too far from us at all, right across the railroad tracks out in back of our property over on a street called Railroad Avenue. I remember feeling slightly shocked and disturbed when Dahlia informed my dad of her address, because I had always heard really bad things about Railroad Avenue and about the people who lived over there. When we pulled up in front of Dahlia's house, my dad got out of the car telling me to stay put. He came around the car and opened Dahlia's door for her, helping her out onto the walk. Dahlia and I bid each other goodbye through the open car windows separated by a closed door, and Dad escorted her up onto the porch, spanning the entire length of the clapboard house in which Dahlia lived. Mrs. Ryan, Dahlia's father, cordially welcomed them, swinging open the front screen door. My dad shook Mrs. Ryan's hand, and I heard him tell her how much we had enjoyed having Dahlia over and what a delightful little girl she had been raising there for herself. Then my dad got back into his big 1966 Buick LeSabre, and we headed home. As we drove back up Railroad Avenue towards the unmarked yet well-understood cutoff segregation point at Lenox Road, I mentioned to my father, "You know, Dad, Railroad Avenue doesn't actually seem that bad a place to live after all." "It is a bad place, son," my dad responded dryly, taking his eye off the road ahead to look at me and drive his point even more forcefully home. "Trust me, it is about as bad a place as you can find in this part of town." I had never been down Railroad Avenue before that afternoon driving Dahlia Ryan home, and I'm not sure I ever had the opportunity to visit there again. The property is now encompassed by the Lenox Square MARTA station. That station was built on the site of what I now know was once called Johnsontown, a small community of about 30 African American families originally settled back in 1912. The property were acquired in the early 1980s, making the Seller families moderately wealthy for their time, and their houses were all raised to make way for the city's new rapid transit system. The station opened in 1984, extending the Northeast Line from the Arts Center in Midtown up to Lenox Square in Buckhead, and then on out to the upper echelons of DeKalb County at Brookhaven and Oglethorpe University. When my dad and I got back home again, my mom was there waiting for us at the kitchen table. She had fresh and delightfully ice-cold glasses of milk ready for all three of us, along with more warm cookies. It seemed like a very special occasion to me. As we snacked on my second helping of milk and cookies for that afternoon, my parents explained to me why I could never invite Dahlia Ryan over to play again, why I could never invite anyone who looked like Dahlia Ryan over to play again. I honestly do not remember my parents ever telling me it was because Dahlia was black. I remember them making it more about the fact that she lived on Railroad Avenue with all those other people who we do not associate with. I supposed I understood their meaning eventually, and I never really liked it. I got a good lesson in geography from my father that afternoon, driving Dahlia home from our house. I learned that on a map, or as the crow flies, Rockhaven Circle and Railroad Avenue might appear to exist within literal spitting distance of each other, or at most a stone's throw away. Yet in the minds of the residents who live there on either of these two culturally, racially, socially, economically, politically, psychologically distinct streets, the two were then and would remain always, proverbially, worlds apart from one another. Dahlia never did come back over to play again, and she never extended what might otherwise have been considered an expected reciprocal invitation to me to visit her house after school one afternoon. We retained our status as the Foursquare Ball championships of R.L. Hope third grade class, and we exchanged pleasantries, pleasant enough pleasantries, in the halls or waiting in line for our separate but equal buses to carry us to our separate but equal homes. Well, maybe not equal. In 1998, by then a lawyer myself, I learned that Dahlia was elected to the Georgia House General Assembly. I wrote her a letter of congratulations, reminding her of our shared educational experience of grammar school. She never responded, not that I could blame her. I'm sure she was very busy. I never got around to sending her a note when she later won election to the Georgia Senate, where I understand she still serves the people of Georgia to this day. It was, and sadly remains so to this day, to one extent or the other, the systematic inbred malignancy of racism, white supremacy, and hatred for the other, anybody who doesn't look like you, doesn't think like us, act like us, think like you. It was also my first indoctrination into the idea of the tacit class system that is perpetuated throughout this country. If not a true monarchical caste system of noble gentry and pauper peasants, then certainly more silently creeping insipid, unspoken, insidious, incestuous notions of the haves and the less fortunate have-nots, the have-mores versus the have-lesses, allowing the haves and the mores to consider themselves superior to the other, the lesser. Instinctively knowing and understanding that Dahlia Ryan could never come over to play with me after school again was very much like my innate instinctive knowing that I could never tell either of my parents, or anybody else for that matter, that my first wet dream was, and most of my subsequent dreams of any sexual nature were, about Connor Burroughs or some other little boy I liked at school. Several years prior to this unsettling dream, my parents already had given me the birds and the bees sex talk. Upon moving to our new suburban home on Rockhaven Circle, we somehow managed to inherit a white Persian cat, who we named Snowball. Snowball had one green eye and one blue eye, and she would just as soon scratch you as look at you. Given her inhospitable attitude towards most of all the world, my folks were somewhat astonished when Snowball turned up pregnant. No one but Snowball ever knew the identity of some neighborhood alley cat scoundrel who sired her kittens. Still, when she started giving birth in the corner of the kitchen one night while we were eating dinner, I watched the entire spectacle of each of the 5 kitten births with utter awe and amazement. Too excited to eat, I had lots of questions, each of which Mama and Dad dutifully, truthfully, and patiently answered for me. During my many revelations from the discussions of where babies come from, my parents even prepared me for the eventuality of just the sort of wet dream as I did eventually have. They told me that the dream would be basically akin to peeing the bed, but this should be considered an acceptable, understandable, and even predictable bedwetting episode for a young man like myself. What's more, they said, it would just happen naturally when I was having a pleasurable dream about some little girl, perhaps Colleen Masterson from school or Linda Graham from across the street. Why hadn't they told me of the possibility that it might be about some little boy I liked in school named Connor Burroughs? Just as instinctively, immediately aware that something was wrong with my dream, I decided that something was wrong with me. I was damaged, or my brain was damaged, or maybe just my dreams were damaged and malfunctioning. I also knew, even without being told or warned or guided, that this was another one of those tacitly taboo subjects, never to be mentioned of or spoken to anyone. A red flashing light internal warning system in my gut prevented me from running downstairs in the morning like Wally or Beaver, announcing to Ward and June Cleaver excitedly over the breakfast table, "Hey, Mom, hey, Dad, you know that wet dream business you told me about? That I'd be having about Linda Graham or Colleen Masterson? Well, I had one of those crazy dreams last night, and boy, oh boy, what a great dream it was, too. But I dreamed about Connor Burroughs from school, not Linda or Colleen. And Connor's a boy, not a girl. What the heck is up with that?" No, there was no such breakfast room table discussions of sexual preference or identification over waffles and pancakes and orange juice. That never occurred for me, not in the household I grew up in, and I suspect not in the households of countless other children who dreamed like me. Not even Connor Burroughs ever knew that I was having erotic dreams about him. I always knew that I had to keep that secret exclusively to myself. And that at that very early, tender age, 3 deep, dark secrets already shaped and clouded the awareness of my perceptions of the world around me. I could not be close friends with Dahlia Ryan because she was black. I was somehow defective because I had sexy dreams about boys in my class at school. And I could never, ever tell anybody how much my dad and my mom drank or how often they got drunk. My parents gave me quite my fine first discernible lesson in precisely how to prejudge people who did not look like me, or speak like me, or think like me, or act like me. It was my first recalled indoctrination into what I would come to know as my home in the racist South 100 years after the Civil War. At 8 years old, I began to understand what it meant to hate the other, and in so doing, I began learning to hate parts of myself. For my soul always remembered what I was taught to regard as other, really being no different from me. And as I got older, I never met anybody who looked exactly like me. Bless them all, though. I have met many folks who think like me, who act in manners similar to how I act, who love the way I love, and who have the same kind of dreams that I dream. And so, parents across the South determined to prevent their precious darling, lily-white and presumptively homogeneously heterosexual little children from going to school with colored or queer kids by the implementation of new federal segregation rules in 1970. Even the reach of Miss Adair's authority as school principal, under threat of revelation of her lesbian sister, Miss Elizabeth, by my mother, could circumvent implementation of the new federal mandates on integration. My friend Kit's parents, Polly and William Holloway, like my parents, Carolyn and C.Q. Worth, followed suit, setting about getting Kit and myself admitted into at least one of the 3 legally sanctioned all-white private schools, pre-kindergarten through 12th grade in Atlanta at the time. My parents made the conscious decision to drive me 15 miles each way, 5 days each week, to a private school over in northwest Atlanta, rather than to allow me to ride a different bus to a different grammar school, which was less than 5 miles and as many minutes away from our house. Being only 10 years old when all this transpired, I like to tell myself now that I was too young to understand the intricacies of my parents' decision-making process. The messaging I learned from the overall experience, however, was indelibly clear and still resonates with shame inside certain parts of me. Busing to black schools with black kids was bad. Driving further to white schools with white kids was good. The decisions made, our respective parents subjected both Kit and myself to a grueling battery of admission tests required by each of the 3 private institutions. Conveniently, since so many pairs of panicked, diversity-adverse Atlanta parents were getting their children tested at all 3, First Pace Academy, then Westminster Schools, and finally the Lovett School, each held their admissions test on 3 consecutive Saturday mornings. Unbeknownst to either of us at the time, apparently Kit and I were present together at all 3 schools on each of the 3 sequential testing Saturdays. Because Lovett had the last day of the 3 tests, and because all 3 schools conveniently gave the same standardized test for ease of some early computerized grading system, Kit and I both were quite accustomed, and practiced at the same test-taking business. Supposedly, we both scored off the charts on the Lovett version of the test, and both got offered prime seats in the gifted group for the upcoming 6th grade class at the Episcopalian-affiliated Lovett School. Polly and Carolyn reconnected while sitting together in Kit's and my Lovett orientation one Saturday in August of 1970, and the rest, as they say, is history. Kit and I have been fast friends ever since. To her good credit, at least in my mind, Kit had not attended either the Thursday or the Friday night reunion events either. So on Saturday night, October the 8th, 1988, Kit and I got ourselves all gussied up and set off to the Piedmont Driving Club for the class of 1978 dance party fete. For as long as I can remember, the Piedmont Driving Club has always been considered an exclusive, elite, private establishment for the rich upper crust and socially upward mobile classes, specifically those exceedingly white upper echelon classes. I had only been to the club on a handful of occasions previous to the night of our Lovett reunion there. I'd always been there before to attend either debutante parties during summers home from college or wedding receptions of exceptionally wealthy friends and relatives. Originally founded in 1887 as the Gentlemen's Driving Club, its name reflects members' interest in and enthusiasm for driving their horse-drawn carriages onto the club grounds. I had always mistakenly believed that it referred to as a driving club in reference to its history with golfing, something to do with putters as opposed to drivers, I supposed. Honestly, the only thing I've ever found remotely entertaining about the game of golf is drinking cold beer while driving around the course in the cart. The club actually had only ever been used as a golf course briefly. In 1904, the city of Atlanta purchased 190 acres of the golf course lands from the Gentlemen's Club and created what is still known today as Piedmont Park, and what still represents Atlanta's equivalent to Central Park in New York City. As of the auspicious night of our high school reunion back in 1988, the prestigious Piedmont Driving Club had never admitted a single black member. That specific landmark occasion in race relations would not occur until several years later in 1994. At the 10-year class reunion of the Lovett class of 1978, the only African American people we would encounter at the driving club were virtually invisible to us, unnoticed, innocuous, either parking our cars or serving our drinks or clearing away our discarded dishware. Not a whole hell of a lot had changed in Atlanta during the preceding 125 years. So thus, sitting there at McNeely's that early October evening in 1988, Kit and I girded our loins, readied our armors, gilded our lilies, and fortified ourselves with as much good Irish whiskey as we either of us could handle on otherwise empty stomachs. Then we made off from the safety of our booth at the tavern on our way the short drive through our old accustomed stomping grounds, down Peachtree Street, over Beverly Road, and through Ansley Park, across to the immaculately manicured, impendingly impressive Piedmont Driving Club. End of chapter 2. I hope you enjoyed it. And join me again as we get into chapter 3.